I thought, well, actually, if we could create a place where we could curate all of these high value, high impact, evidence based, human centered podcasts in one location focused around health, then that would be a benefit for listeners and also for the creators that are trying to be put alongside these credible pieces of content.
Most of us have a mission statement, but how many of us have an integrity pledge? That's taking things to a completely different level. And yet, for Dan Kendall, it's not a marketing move. It's the filter that determines who gets in and who doesn't. And that's exactly why I want to sit down with Dan, founder of healthpodcast.org and the Health Podcast Library. Dan spent decades in health innovation before building one of the earliest podcast networks focused exclusively on evidence-based health content. Along the way, he flipped his monetization strategy, rebuilt the platform from scratch, and landed on a structure where editorial standards aren't a footnote, they're the front door. I'm Greg Wasserman, the host of Podcast Network Insights. For 15 years, I spent time in the media industry, and the last 5 years immersed in the podcasting industry. Along the way, I've built numerous relationships and spent time with every kind of podcaster, whether it's a new podcaster just starting out, or in the case of this show, podcast network operators. If you've ever wondered whether joining a network makes sense, or how these networks actually operate, my goal is to give you a real look behind the scenes so you can confidently navigate your next move, whether you host, produce, advertise, or run a network. I want you to focus on this conversation with Dan and pay attention to how he got into podcasting, the evolution of his network, and how passion for the health industry is truly at the heart of how he's looking at podcasting and the business. You'll want to take notes. You want to start working on your own integrity pledge. So let's get into this conversation. Well, the name of the show is Podcast Network Insights. So I always like to start with the simple question of when you hear the word podcast and network, what comes to your mind, Dan?
I think it's pretty self-explanatory. I used to have shirts that say Health Podcast Network, and people asked me what that was, and I would sort of smile and look at them kindly and say, what do you think a health podcast network is? And they would say, we think it's a podcast network about health. That's exactly it. So basically trying to connect people and trying to raise the tide so it can lift all the boats.
So why? What made you create a network? I mean, for anyone that's listening, I at least know the story. I mean, this is a unique one where you started the medical field, started your own podcast, started a network, but based on what you just described of what a podcast network, like why?
So I started a podcast in 2016, but I've been listening since 2005. And by 2018, I was fortunate enough to have been able to put together a business model that I was able to podcast full time. So I was creating podcasts for myself, using sponsorship on an annual basis, and then also working with companies that wanted to produce their own podcasts. And I kept finding over and over that their chief complaint or concern was, how am I going to get this podcast discovered? And at the time, in 2018, there was no Spotify podcasts. There was pretty much only Apple. There were some apps that pulled from the data of Apple Podcasts and Apple iTunes, I think it was even still called at the time. But there wasn't really anything else that was out there. There was certainly no Amazon Music. There's no Netflix podcasts. So I thought, well, actually, if we could create a place where we could curate all of these high value, high impact, evidence based, human centered podcasts in one location focused around health, then that would be a benefit for listeners and also for the creators that are trying to be put alongside these credible pieces of content.
But what made you, I mean, your background is 30 years in health tech. You've been a founder in the health world. So this is the fun part. It's like, hold on, someone gave up this lucrative career in the health field to ultimately start a podcast, self-sustain as a podcaster, and then go down the path of starting a network per se.
Well, I've always been in innovation. I'm a problem solver. I'm an engineer by training. And even though I was in sales and marketing and product development, I've always considered myself a solutions-oriented person. And I try to observe problems that people and processes are experiencing and encountering and try to find solutions for it. And the solution I found with a podcast was actually to help distribute information on a one-to-many basis. I was working in what was called the digital health field. I'd been working in health innovation for many decades, as you've alluded to. And I realized that I had enough scar tissue, gray hair, and muscle memory that people who were about half my age wanted to pick my brain and wanted to learn from me. And I love sharing the knowledge about how people can scale the cliffs of innovation more quickly. But I realized that my time as my most valuable asset was just limited, and I needed to find a way that I could share information on a one-to-many basis. So that's why I started a podcast, and that really resonated in the healthcare field because I was one of the earliest folks to do that. It's particularly in health innovation. I couldn't find anything, so I was frustrated that I couldn't find anything to listen to. So I decided I would just solve this problem myself. And then I encountered the next problem was, as other people were creating content and asking me to create content, they were saying, well, how are we going to get this discovered? My original idea was that we would create this network, we would publish and attract podcast creators and say they could be a part of it for free, and that we would sell advertising to sustain it. And that hypothesis proved to be incorrect. People were too protective. There's a risk aversion in healthcare, and they were concerned about having advertising that they may not agree with on their content. So I flipped the model and said, well, how about I provide you no services and I charge you instead? And they said, okay. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, but that's how I basically got started. So I started charging people for a service of listing their shows on Health Podcast Network. And then people began to say, hey, we'd like some additional services. Can you provide hosting? We'd like to do dynamic ads. Can you help me with this sponsor? And it just began to unfold. Once I started with that solution mindset and how do I serve this problem and serve this industry in a way that I can figure out how to do that, then the money came and then other opportunities came. And I find that whenever throughout my life is about time and relationships, I always look at it and say, how can I bring service to this problem, to this person, to this population, this issue? What can I do to serve this to get them where they want to go? And I found that in my life, personally, professionally, throughout, good things have happened when I've approached it with a service mindset.
I mean, it seems to be a theme in anyone that's listened to a couple episodes so far, and just mine, the service, which I guess probably why we stay connected with those, the guests that I'm bringing on. We're all of a service mindset, which is incredible. But I guess if I look at, you also started not only your own podcast from a one-to-many, but I think you, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was also helping your family and your daughter's story that ultimately added even more because you were trying to understand specific health information. And I think if I remember our conversation, you turned to podcasts. So what about podcasting? Like, you can go to blogs, you can do a search for all that kind of information. What about specifically on the podcast side that you wanted to create this one-to-many voice?
Yeah. Well, James Cridland says that podcasts are something you can consume when your hands are busy, but your mind is free. My oldest daughter was diagnosed 7 years ago or so with type 1 diabetes, and being number one in the healthcare field, number two in the podcast space, not only did I try to consume everything I possibly could to be the best caregiver and support for her as she began that journey with this, what could be a lifelong disease, I turned to PDFs and books and websites and WebMD and downloaded as much as I could and listened to as much as, or watched as much as I could and read as much as I could. But really, it was the conversations with other individuals that was the most helpful to me. It was on a one-to-one basis. So I thought, well, where can I find podcasts that would talk to me where I am, that would help me on this phase of the journey, which is I don't even understand what this disease is. I don't understand what insulin is or basal or bolus or anything about really how do I count carbs and how do I do this. And I turned to podcasts, and I couldn't find a podcast that met me where I was. There wasn't one that sort of said, this is the beginning step. So I actually created a whole other thing, which we're not here to talk about today, but I'm still very passionate about, which is called Health Unmuted. And Health Unmuted is a podcast library of podcast miniseries that basically, instead of saying, here is episode 187 about type 1 diabetes, and we're going to talk to somebody who climbed Kilimanjaro and kept her insulin from freezing, which is not what you want to hear about when your daughter's been diagnosed and you're just trying to figure out, can I get her back to school and can she still take swim lessons? We dialed it back and we said, actually, let's start a mini series that just basically is a narrated short form podcast that features people where they are and answers questions that are relevant for their stage in their disease journey. So that's a whole Health Unmuted thing, which is still available, healthunmuted.com. We're still working on that, but our focus has shifted in 2026 towards something that you've helped inspire me to create.
I love that. So with that said, we've kind of gone, You look at the value of information. We've had other guests on here in different niches, but like the health world is, I mean, if I remember correctly, like your mission on why we've done this is how do we proliferate the actual correct health information? You've already touched on the fact that certain podcasters didn't want advertisers on their show because it wasn't aligned. How do you go about like with a podcast network that's so niched on health, but like there's so much information, we get overwhelmed with, I mean, I even just look at my mother. She's like, you shouldn't be eating steak like this. I'm like, Mom, where'd you read that? Like, it's on the news, and waited 5 months and it's going to be a different story. So how from a network do you choose the shows that are going to be on there, the right information that's going to be there? I have to imagine that's got to be stressful.
Well, actually, let's just dial it back for a second, because I don't know how well your listeners know you and know your influence, but I have to just give a little personal testimony to the impact you've had in the short number of years that I've known you. You were so instrumental in encouraging me to step into the unknown. It was a little over a year ago. It was in January of 2025 that I was considering, and had been considering for some time, around what do I do? What's the next place where I can make an impact in health and podcasting at this intersection? And even, is there a problem that I can solve? Is this a place? Is this something that I can bring some value here? And you really encouraged me to step into that next step. And the first step that I did, with your encouragement and actually an introduction that you made for me, was to do a summit. And that summit gave me an opportunity to listen to what was happening and what the concerns were. And that summit, healthpodcastsummit.com, that we did last year, free to attend, all virtual, thousands of people subscribed to that and spent hours and hours consuming that content, still available, healthpodcastsummit.com. And it was such an eye-opener to me about the scale of the issues that were facing people working at the intersection of health and podcasting. We're under attack from AI. AI is creating misinformation. The health sector and science and medicine are under attack from algorithms. They are amplifying information that is not necessarily aligned with people's best interests and informed decision-making. And then there are other factors that I don't want to make this political, but we can see in the headlines that there are structural changes in the way the United States, which has led in science and medicine in many ways for decades, there's real structural changes, from grants being unfunded to laboratories closing to scientists leaving or not coming here. And it's, even vaccines that were not being recommended. And for a career healthcare person that's worked with health professionals for decades, this is real concerning. So having that Health Podcast Summit gave me an opportunity to do something constructive, to share information about what people are doing to share this information when their hands are busy but their mind is free, and to affect that soft tissue between their ears to make a human being a more empowered version of themselves, whether they're looking after themselves or their family members or the people in their communities. So that's really sort of the journey of what we've gone on. And we've seen a huge change and shift in podcasting broadly, not just in healthcare, but just the overall ecosystem, with it getting recognized at the Grammys and having more celebrities get involved, having the traditional mainstream media have layoffs and move into other ways of making money and to promote their messages, whether through Substack or podcasts and so forth. So we're seeing a lot of changes, and healthcare's always been a bit of a laggard in various ways. My whole career has been in health innovation. I get that. But now, after 10 years of doing this, it's finally at the point where I can feel the momentum growing. I feel the earth shaking under our feet as we see a lot of change to medicine, science, and healthcare. And I see an opportunity for people who want to listen, create, or support health podcasts in a meaningful way.
So then how do you choose, if I'm a health podcast, how do you choose whether I join your network or not? Is there a filter that you put on the certain kinds of shows? I have to imagine it's an interesting, unique perspective that you have to go through as the operator of the health podcast org.
So first of all, it's invitation only. People can apply for an invitation, and we will consider that. Last year and in previous years, because we launched our Health Podcast Network, which is actually something we're building on as we go forward, but we launched Health Podcast Network in January 2020. And at the time, and for the 5 or so years after that, we really would sit and listen to people's content, review their sort of individual credentials, and decide whether or not they were aligned. And what I would say to people is, look, this is not for green smoothies and six-pack abs. There's a place for that. It's called the internet, and you can compete there. Look, there's nothing wrong with six-pack abs and yoga retreats and green smoothies. I like those things. Those are all great. but really we're around science and medicine and how do we empower, firstly, the health professionals, because they are the ones that are taking care of thousands and millions and billions of people around the world, but also information directly for people like your mom and for you and for me to be able to understand how do we take care of ourselves and the people in our community. So actually last year, it was about a year ago, it was January 2025. This was coming off the election as we saw RFK Jr. getting nominated and various things happening that were really making people that I've worked with for decades and the organizations I've worked with for decades say, how is this going to go? And we said, actually, we need to establish some sort of level of base trust. So I went looking for organizations and I found several organizations, nonprofits, that are focused around trust in science and health communications. And we can list them in the show notes. Their names, I think one is Coalition for Healthcare Communications. The other is the Coalition for Trust in Health and Science. So kind of long names, but wonderful organizations. And I worked with them and got some advice from them, and we put together a health content integrity pledge. You can find it on our website, healthpodcast.org. 7 points that really, frankly, should not be controversial. We are led by data. We will separate and make clear between fact and opinion. We will make sure that if there is sponsorship or advertising or commercial messages, that is clearly delineated with sound or music and transitions away from the core content. And if there are errors, then people will do retractions. These should not be controversial facts or ways of working. So that's one of the things, is putting that out there. And then we do also work on a referral system. And now that we have a basis of members, it's sort of like Clubhouse back in the early parts of COVID, where you had to know somebody to get a referral code in. We're now relying on our members of our network to say, who else do you want to be put alongside with? Because one of the big concerns that people said to me when we were launching the original network was, well, how do I know I'm not going to be next to some snake oil salesman or something that I don't want? And my answer was, that's exactly what you have today. You're telling me you don't want to join my network because you want to stay on Apple and Spotify? Well, guess what? Apple and Spotify is promoting those people, sometimes paying those people that are creating information that you're trying to work against in your clinics and your hospitals. And we're providing an alternative place where we're curating and saying, yeah, you might have a valid RSS feed, but you can't come in here because we believe in science and medicine and evidence-based information. So that's what we're trying to create and curate.
So anyone that's listening, just what Dan just described from an operational standpoint, from the way he's thinking about this network, can take that aside, but just the operational side of it is completely unique from other networks that I've talked to. I mean, that's what I love about where I sit, is how each, whether it's a niche or general market, is looking at the technology or the operational side of it. So with that said, like, what is your operation? I mean, you've got tech, I have to imagine, as a tech person who's 30 years, like the checks and balances, the moderation, the community that you're building. Walk me through how you've created this over the last, 7, 8 years you described.
Greg, I'm a little bit triggered. That's the second time that you've mentioned 30 years. You're making me feel really old.
I didn't say 30 years. I said the last 7 years.
No, you said 30 years earlier, so it's funny.
Okay.
I'm feeling a little bit old. I'm like, wow, I'm racing against the clock here. I got a lot of work to do. So look, I mentioned...
I guess that's also anyone that's listening. I mean, the fact that you've been doing the health world for 30 years allows you to operate this network in such a way, whereas someone who's starting a network 5 years ago is going like, hold on, I have this vision, but they still don't know where the health industry's been. So yes, the gray hairs we both have is worth it, because that allows you to create it, not only what you've got, but also how you're operating it. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, look, the reason I wanted to share that story about over a year ago when you encouraged me and introduced me to the lady Jenny Wright, who helped me get Health Podcast Summit launched, the reason that I spoke about that was because that led to a face-to-face, one-to-one conversation with a lot of people who were having challenges at the intersection of health and podcasting. And that's what led me to discover, actually, there are some things that I can build here. So what we've launched on the heels of that summit, on the heels of your encouragement, is now a whole new organization called healthpodcast.org. It's still a for-profit company. It's a doing business as name of mission-based media. And they're one organization with one mission and 4 platforms. The one mission is to elevate and amplify credible health podcasts. Look, you can get on Apple, you can get on Spotify, you can get on YouTube now, and all those are great places where people should have their content available. They should definitely be distributing through those platforms because they have audiences, they have networks, they have algorithms, and they should put them out there. What we're saying is we want to have people who are not necessarily traditional podcast listeners and maybe don't know how to get started into a different environment. So the 4 platforms are, number one, the summit. We're doing that again this year. We've also announced a health podcast awards. We often see that the podcast category is lumped in with a lot of other sorts of awards in healthcare. We thought, actually, let's do a whole awards ceremony service program around exclusively podcasts, whether it's for doctors, nurses, pharmacists, patients, caregivers, part of an omni-channel strategy, whatever it might be. We also have a health podcast show, which is the content that came away from the Health Podcast Summit and other content we're creating to be a part of this sort of meta idea of how do we do a podcast about podcasting in healthcare and try to encourage other people to do it, I guess similar to what you're doing here with this podcast network show. And then the fourth most important piece in my mind is the technology that underpins it. And that's where we're taking what we've done at Health Podcast Network, and we have already just completely reimagined what it can be. We encountered some scaling issues with the software we built it on. We realized we should have built in a capability of having individuals create their own profiles, follower lists, and playlists. We wanted to be able to integrate video. So we've launched this whole new platform called Health Podcast Library, where all of this is merged together. So people can go there and they can discover based on topics or keywords or speakers, and then they can find links not only to consume that content, to add it to their own follow list or to add it to their own playlist, but also importantly then be able to go and say that, let me find the Spotify, the YouTube, the whatever podcast link so that I can listen to it when I get in the car or when I start my jog or my dog walk or start making dinner. So those are the 4 parts of this overall ecosystem, and that technology, the library, is essentially what's replacing Health Podcast Network and is the next generation of where we're going here.
So from a monetization standpoint, how we make money, you've talked about the evolution. At one point, it was the sponsorships, and people are like, no. So it's like, all right, pay a monthly fee or a yearly subscription. So 7 years, you've got this, the evolution of it. What have you decided moving into 2026 now that you're looking at the different ways that you're making money from a network standpoint?
This is something that we continue to think a lot about and evolve. So we got to the point where we were charging several $1,000s a year for people to be a part of the network. And there were simply more people that were beginning to say no because they weren't able to afford that sort of investment, particularly as we're experiencing a lot of economic hardships right now. So we took a look at it, and with the library, we have a few different pricing options. And one of the things that people always said to me was, gosh, I get so much out of these one-to-one conversations. You've just completely helped direct my content, my creation in the right way, whether it was around technology or storytelling or access to people or ways to approach their business overall, what they were trying to do. So I've built coaching into some of the different pricing plans. But ultimately, what's also really changed over the past 7 years or so that I've been doing this and thinking about podcast networks is that the podcast creators and the podcast sponsors and advertisers are now closer together. So the people who are creating podcasts or who are thinking about making podcasts are saying, we want to utilize this dynamic audio insertion technology. We want to use it to promote our book, our event, our upcoming launch, the fact that this is an awareness month, this other episode that we recorded 3 months ago that's relevant now because of something that's happened in the news. So we want to utilize that technology. We can help them with that. And then we also have sponsors that are saying, well, we want to reach those audiences in a very contextually relevant way. So, this is what I say to the podcast creators is you're not running an ad. You are actually serving your audience more effectively by giving them contextual relevant information while they are spending time with something that they have opted into. They're not watching this on Good Morning America. They're not driving by this on the highway and seeing it on a billboard. They're not watching this on the seat back in front of them. They are electing to spend time with this content. And then you as an advertiser and you as a creator can say, and here's something else that you might find relevant. And I find that especially powerful in this area of healthcare, whether it's patients or caregivers or professionals, that you can then align those two things in a meaningful way. So we think advertising and sponsorship is going to be a real driver across our business and across the health industry overall.
What you're doing and the way you're approaching this, is it unique to your field in the health world, or could someone model their other niche podcast business and follow your lead on it? It feels like the health information and the way you're approaching this is very unique to what you're doing. But it also feels like maybe someone else could, if I was a network operator listening to this right now and going like, why am I not doing this? Would you say, yes, you should be, or going like, it's probably only going to work for my side of the business?
No, God, I hope it's not only going to work because I think that what we've built, when I approach product development and solutions, I think, how can this scale? And when we've iterated and worked on this software for Health Podcast Library, we very much thought about how can we make this something that can apply to other sectors in healthcare, whether it's, clinical research or type 1 diabetes patients or nurses or pharmacists. We've thought about that, but we've also been thinking, well, how can this apply to other sectors, other verticals, sports, parenting, college choices, these are things that I'm going through right now as a parent. There's multiple ways that I think people can look at this, and I'd be happy to have conversations. I'm part of the Podcast Network Alliance. I've worked with a lot of other podcast network owners that are talking about how we can strategize. And I have to say that the software we've developed and the person with whom we've developed it, I think is the best solution out there across all the different platforms. I'm really excited to explore other ways that this can be used in other sectors.
I mean, I knew Sunny in the Alliance, and I know many of you that are guests on the show here from that or connected you to Sunny in that regards. But yeah, the uniqueness of each network, and that's where I've got this from a podcast standpoint, the conversations you and I've had over the years, the fact that I pushed you to do the summit, pushed you to do the awards, and it's just mind-boggling to go where you've taken the business, but what you've learned from doing that. I think there's a lot that network operators can value from the way you're approaching this. But from a podcaster, the other side is I could go join, this is no knock to anyone, but it's like I could go join iHeart as the biggest podcast. I'm just going to get something completely different from them on the health side than I am from. So if I'm evaluating why should I join the healthpodcast.org versus any other network, what are the red flags I should be considering when I'm evaluating a network?
Well, first of all, I don't think that anybody should limit their choices. And actually, we've had some people that have been interested in joining us, and we're like, hey, you can be a part of our library, you can be a part of our network. But the people that they were interested in working with, I won't name names, but they've said, no, you can't do both. But I believe that podcasts should be discoverable wherever they are. What we're trying to do then is create this space where we can have this high value, high impact, evidence-based, human-centered content curated in one location. And I think that people need to look at what are they really getting. A lot of people ask me, this is one of the things that sort of frustrates me a little bit about how people approach podcast networks. They ask all the time, if I join your network, if I join Health Podcast Library, how many more listens am I going to get? And my answer to them is, when you go to a gym and put down your money and sign up, do you automatically get healthier? Or is that just the beginning of a process? You need to go in and lift the weights. You need to show up, turn up, and put in the work. And what we're going to do, to use that gym analogy, is we're going to make sure that we have the best instructors, the best people in the classes that are also similarly motivated. We're going to make sure that you have the best access to equipment, that you know how to use it properly. And then if you show up and do the work, then you can actually have some of the benefits, whether it's a smaller waist size, the lower BMI, or better podcasts, better podcast downloads. But how can you point to joining a network and saying that's what flipped the switch? Just like joining a gym, maybe it was learning to eat more vegetables or cutting back on the sweets or stopping that glass of wine at 9 o'clock at night. Maybe that's what led to those physical changes. Same thing with us. Is it the way that you learned to change your titles? Is it a way you started to use a better platform for recording? Is it a way that you've now got a better podcast host using RSS.com or something like that that give them better tools to be able to practice their craft? Who knows where that points to? I don't want to take credit when people see big gains in their downloads. I can't say it's because they joined the network, but I can look at it as a coach or as a participant or a trainer and say, yeah, I had something to do with that because that person is able to do that partly because of being involved with my gym, if you will.
I love that. I think if anyone's listening to any of these episodes, you're going to hear the same common theme. And that's what's great to have every network operator say. It's grit, it's hustle. There's no magic pill. Whether you join a network or you're doing it solo, you still have to continue to refine your work. You have to put the grind in there. You have to stay consistent because most, as we know, fade out and they're like, oh, this isn't working. I'm not growing. It's like, you just got to keep doing it. But I guess to that point, how much would you say it is systems versus the hustle and the grind?
So I want to click on one thing you said there in terms of consistency. So one of the things that I heard from Tom Webster, one of the founders of Sounds Profitable, one of the things he said about consistency is that it is important to be consistent, but not in the way a lot of people think. A lot of people think of consistency, and this is what actually puts people off of doing a podcast, is they think, oh my God, if I have to publish something at 7 a.m. on Tuesday every week for the next 52 weeks, I'm not going to start. And what Tom Webster said was, you need to be consistent, but you need to be consistent in how you deliver quality. You need to honor that listener every time you publish. You need to make sure that you are using exactly as long as it takes to tell that story, that you're providing value, that you are serving them in a meaningful way so that when they exchange their tap and time for your content, they're actually emerging from that in some sort of transformational way. And that's what I always think about with selling or anything that we're doing. We're always changing. We're always transforming, transitioning from one state to another. Either I don't have this information or knowledge, or I do, or I understand how to apply this, or I don't. So how are we moving people along that pathway? So consistency and quality is really critically important. And then I think a lot of people still are looking for quick answers. They're looking for quick things that they can click on and say, oh, my numbers are up. Well, guess what? There are lots of organizations that can do that, and I'm happy to make introductions to some of the more credible ones that are able to put paid spending. But even the great ones will say paid is after you've done your own organic, using your own platforms and your own reach, putting your link to your podcast in your email signature, making sure it's discoverable on your website. Make sure you have a website. These are all basic things. The next thing is the earned piece, like being able to be on shows and be on podcasts and earn some attention. And then you layer on the paid piece after that. So you need to put all these things together. It's not just going to be a quick thing. People look at Mel Robbins or some of these other names I won't mention that they're all successful. Well, they've put in a lot of hours, and they didn't just spend a certain amount per month in order to get there. They really made it their credo. They were students of the game. They put in the work. They showed up, and they figured out how to serve their listeners in a way that was very effective, that got them to where they're going.
Now, I love that. When I was running Play RFM, it was always funny going like, I would say to everyone, look, you have a podcast. Your podcast is on our listing platform. How do I help you grow it? And I would give them, after doing this for so long, my tips and tricks of titles and descriptions. I mean, if I don't know your show, if I'm looking at that, and so many people would be like, nah, I don't want to spend the time fixing my titles and descriptions. How much is it to do an ad on Player FM? And I'm like, I mean, you could spend all the money you want, but if the packaging, if no one's going to click on it, why are you going to spend the money? And it's as you said, we're, as consumers, I'm going to say my own words and way of saying it, but like, we're consumers are lazy. It's like, I'd much rather spend the $3,000 to promote this than spend the time and energy of fixing the actual title and description so the packaging's better at someone when they take it off the shelf. It's actually what they want, right?
It's that word of mouth as well. When you serve those people well, I just had a call earlier with some, I said, look, you got to do the basics. You got to get a website. You got to make sure that your podcast is visible on your website. And I don't mean like on a drop down in a menu. I mean like on the footer. You put your X and your Instagram and your LinkedIn and your YouTube channel down there in the bottom of your footer, but you're not putting a link to listen to it on Apple or Spotify. That's where you want them to go, where they can engage more deeply with your brand. And people aren't doing those sorts of basic things. I really encourage people to think about all those basic steps they can take. When they see somebody posting on LinkedIn, reach out to that person and say, where did you find it? What did you like? What else do you want to hear more of? Can you share this with your organization? Can you put this on your LinkedIn post and share this out? And also getting those guests to come on there. There's so many basic things that people often overlook because they think that there's some sort of magic formula out there that's going to suddenly skyrocket them, instead of all these singles, these base hits that they're doing over and over consistently that's really going to put them on the boards.
So changing terms a little bit, ROI, right? We look at the podcasters in your network, the podcasters you're working with, and then the advertising side of it. Like, how do you measure ROI? How do your advertisers measure ROI, especially since it is niche, it is health, but like there are certain protocols and levels of restraints that one has to do when we're talking about health and podcasting or health and advertising.
Yeah, and this is where it's a very personal discussion with each person. First of all, I really encourage that people think about how they use dynamic audio insertion. It's really important to think broadly about the content that they're creating. That's one of the things we try to get our podcast network members to think about is how are they using that? How are they using advertising, whether it's baked in or dynamic? Just how are they thinking about all the touch points? Because some people will look at it and they'll say, well, I only have, to be really candid, 500 downloads. That's not thousands. That's not 250,000. I mean, 250 downloads on an episode, sometimes 15, 20, 30,000 per episode. Those are great numbers at that higher end. But the reality is a lot of people are much more at that lower end. But these people are professionals. You don't accidentally become a doctor or a nurse. So there's real value in having that person carry that message to their audience. And you don't accidentally stumble into some of this content to hear about Parkinson's disease or COPD or patient advocacy. You're there with a purpose. You have a reason for wanting to listen to that. So that contextual relevance is very valuable for advertisers. And one of the things that we do as a podcast network is we educate those advertisers about how they can engage effectively. Because everybody wants to come on and say, hey, how can we be a guest on your show, one of your shows? And really it's around what you really want to do is engage effectively with the audience. You don't want to be a guest. You want to serve and reach that audience in an effective way. And then we work with the podcast creators to say, here's how you can structure your offering in an effective way so that maybe you are doing a bespoke podcast creation. We call them coffee talks. Maybe you are doing a social media campaign. Maybe you're doing a newsletter alongside. Maybe you're actually talking about this when you go to some of your conferences and you're actually steering people one-to-one on saying, hey, here's a company that I recommend. I had their CEO or CMO or CTO on my show. So there's multiple ways that we're trying to educate both sides of this. And, I try to bring the healthcare industry into the podcasting world and the podcasting world into healthcare so they can understand better what the tools are and the structures are. I was just in your neighborhood last week in LA at the Vive conference, and I love that event. I love all those events that Vive and Health and so many other organizations do, like CNS Summit. The reality is people spend tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, sometimes literally seven figures to go to some of these conferences. I've seen them two-story exhibition booths that are a block wide. I'm not exaggerating. Some of these booths for the medical event, I'm sure in other industries as well, can be absolutely enormous with conference rooms and theaters and all sorts of things on a show floor. So they're spending that kind of money for 3 days, hoping that their ideal client walks by and stumbles in and spends some time there. And what I'm saying is you've got 24/7, 365 that you have the opportunity to engage with your ideal client around this ideal content. And what's most powerful is instead of stumbling into Las Vegas and walking through the convention hall, these people who are listening to these podcasts are saying, you know what? You can come in the car with me. You can come in the kitchen with me while I'm making dinner. You can go on a dog walk. And that sort of personal, intimate time where they only spend with their family and friends. And now they're inviting your voice, your brand, your message into that environment because they're ready and at a point where they can hear it. It's really powerful. I'm a former sales rep, and I've said to someone recently, I said, look, when I was carrying a sales bag and if I was dealing with a doctor and they said to me, hey, Dan, I love what you have to say, but I don't have time to listen to it right now. If you jump in the front seat of the car with me, I'll listen to you while I'm driving home. I would absolutely walk back from that person's home in order to have that half an hour on that drive to talk with them. And that's essentially what podcasting does. And trying to get people in healthcare to understand the power of spoken word and share that information and share that space and time with their ideal client is really powerful. And people begin to realize it, particularly now after 10 years of talking about it.
You align so much with what I say, like why everyone should have a podcast, because as you said, if I could have a 30 minutes with a doctor next to them in their car, when they're telling me, no, I don't have time, think about it. How many times we've been shut out as salespeople and you send the email or you show up at their door. But if I could go ahead and have those conversations or just do a solo episode and get it. So yeah, you're basically telling everyone, if you're in the health industry, start a podcast, and Dan's got a platform to help you with that.
You asked me earlier about can what I'm doing apply to other industries? And I certainly hope so. When you look at a lot of businesses, parts of their organization are people, and it's the sales teams that are out there driving around or on Zoom calls or whatever. And as a 27-year-old sales rep working for a medical device company who is very well trained, and they spent a lot of money training me to be able to have those sort of interactions, both from the sales as well as the technology and the health and medicine, the medical procedure aspect of what I needed to know in order to be effective. If I could say to a doctor, look, I know you're really busy, but here's a podcast that we recorded with Professor so-and-so or the doctor from the School of Medicine at whatever school, and here you can listen to her speak to you. And I know you trained with her, you went to the school, whatever. And they're going to say, oh, I'm going to listen to that because instead of a 27-year-old punk, carrying a sales bag, I'm now going to listen to somebody that I consider a peer that I look up to or that I have heard talk, and they're going to share with me their perspective. That's really meaningful. And it's a great way to leverage that. So that way, when you say, let's get together and talk, they're already primed and ready. You're helping them be a better potential buyer of your solution because you're helping them find ways to engage with your information in a way that isn't requiring them to have you in their office when they could be seeing patients or dealing with other meetings and obligations.
So I guess what comes to mind as we think through some of the things that we've kind of talked about, what's the future? I mean, your business is evolving, but where do you see podcasting? Where do you see podcast networks and the future of podcast networks as video comes in, as you've alluded to, with the podcast elections, with what we've seen from stats on, I think we just surpassed, or podcasting surpassed overall audio consumption. So what are you excited for the next few years in podcasting?
Well, look, I can get excited about a lot of different ideas, and what I really need to focus on is executing in healthcare. As you've alluded to many times on this call, I've spent 30 years in this industry. I know it well. I have a lot of credibility and passion for these topics, and I know that we're actually helping people live healthier lives and get access to care and information, be better decision makers. And so I want to focus on that, but I do see a lot of opportunity across continuing to niche audiences. It is really hard as we see more information coming with Spotify and Netflix on screens and video and Apple now getting into the video scene and all these things that are demanding your attention or requesting your attention and asking you to tune out 4,000 other distractions for you to look at a piece of glass and consume that information there. I think that as we can find other ways to say, if you're interested in sports or politics or business or these various things, or, as I mentioned, college education, things like that, that we can continue to niche people down so they can say, I'm going to look in this pond. I'm not going to look at Netflix or Spotify or Apple and try to sort through all this. I'm going to go to this area that they've already helped me by curating this sort of stuff and prioritizing it. So I think that's really big. I'd love to see more innovation in politics and podcasting. I'd love to see more in kids and education for access. And my daughters and I were talking about it, and they were talking about what podcasts they could listen to. So I bought a few domain names about how we could try to make podcasting more accessible. I think that this story is being written, and I hope that people are beginning to change their minds of what they used to say a few years ago, which was, well, this is just a fad and this is going to tail off. YouTube started 20 years ago about the same time, and it hasn't tailed off. There's more hours being consumed and being uploaded every day than there was the day before. So we're seeing that with podcasting, and I believe people are beginning to realize this is going to be around. And how can we engage as we're seeing the push towards screen-free moments? How do we get people into their life and onto their walks and fit into their ways? I think the audio is going to continue to be a key part of that. And I think that networks or the organizations that will curate that and serve their audiences in a very high impact way, that will continue to grow as well.
If I distill that down, what I'm gathering here, it's aligned very much with, I guess, RSS.com and what we believe, but the niches and the riches, the localization, the niche of a network such as yours on the health side, or as you talked about from a sports or from a children's, the ability to aggregate those conversations and that content and provide whatever it is you're looking to do, but specifically for that catered audience in those shows is where there is a lot of potential for networks, but also in podcasting.
And actually, just one of the things that we're innovating around is around the use of the word network. What we found, I mentioned this before we started recording, we found that the use of the term podcast network was off-putting for some of our target audiences. As an organization, I want to collaborate with other podcast networks that are working in healthcare. There's Bloodstream Podcast Network, there's Pharmacy Podcast Network, there's Healthcare Now Radio. There's different groups that even though the owners of those networks know that I'm not competing, I don't want to do what they're doing. There are other people in the industry that say, oh, aren't you competing with Pharmacy Podcast Network? And, if we work with you, can we work with them? So that's why we chose to go with the name Health Podcast Library, because the library term sort of means like, hey, I don't care what book you've written or want to read, you should be able to find it in your local library, and, whether it's by any publisher. So that's what we're trying to do with this library terminology. And also when you Google the term podcast network, it seems to give some answers around ownership or monetization exclusively, which again is off-putting for some of our members and some of the people who want to be a part of what we're building, because they don't necessarily want to monetize it by selling advertisements for Delta Airlines and Diet Coke. They want to monetize it perhaps in ways of supporting their audiences with continuing education or with getting them to come to events or re-up their membership. So we're trying to help them in that process of how they can serve their audiences most effectively.
Makes a lot of sense. You're looking at it as a holistic kind of component as opposed to it's the original question, what is a podcast? What is a network? When I started our conversation here, and you're like, depends on who's talking. For my industry, the word network is a little off-putting, and how do I look at it in a different way so that it actually creates a collaboration that I want? And I think anyone that's listening, at least on the network side, there is value in how you name it. Is the word network even in the title of your business entity, or in your case, you've gone with library? And so starting to think, how do we reframe, once again, what is a podcast network and how do they operate? One thing I always like to ask people, we've spent a lot of time talking, and not just today, but over the last few years. You have a very unique perspective, and not just on health, but just on the way you operate, what you've driven. What's one book that's been key in your life that's helped you become the person you are, or in the health industry?
Tom Webster and Steve Pratt have both written great books for people in podcasting. One that changed my mindset recently of the past couple of years is 10x is easier than 2x. So Dan Sullivan book, highly recommended to me by someone in the healthcare field. And it's one of those things where one person recommended it, then suddenly 3 other people recommended it within a few weeks. And I was like, wow, I got to listen to this thing. I listen to books. I don't necessarily read them. But then if it's a good book, I buy the book as well. And I dog ear and highlight it, which is what I've done for several of Dan Sullivan's books. And definitely 10x is easier than 2x, because what it made me think was, and this is sort of related to going back to the earlier story where you were encouraging me to do things. So I was thinking there's lots of stuff that I could do to grow incrementally. I can increase this amount 15%, 30%. I can have these different growth goals. But if I wanted to grow 10x, what do I have to stop doing? It puts you in a frame where you have to stop doing certain things in order to be able to focus on that 10x growth. So I think if you're running a podcast or running a podcast network, that definitely thinking about what can you stop doing, because there's lots of things that you can get involved with. Really, how do you focus in your effort? If you needed to grow 10x and you want to grow 10x, how do you do that? Where do you put your energy? And that's a great one I recommend people check out.
We'll have it in the show notes. I love that. Actually, we didn't cover this. How many podcasts right now are in the library or in the network?
The growing number. We had over 100 in the network. The Health Podcast Network dropped down to about 80 as we were beginning this transition. Some people just stopped podcasting and so forth. So we're changing the model as we move towards the Health Podcast Library. We have built this so that it can scale to hundreds of shows, provided that we maintain that focus on quality. So we have over 100 people committed already that want to be a part of it. I believe that we can very easily surpass 500, 600 shows without even questioning the level of quality and scientific rigor and professionalism of the groups. So yeah, stay tuned. We'll continue to grow this in a very meaningful way. healthpodcastlibrary.com.
So with that said, with the growth, one podcast that you would recommend to people that probably is underutilized, underknown, and we can't go with your own, right? No. What would be one that you would recommend to people?
So I think one of the ones that I would recommend that's in health, since we're talking about health, I would recommend Dr. Arkell Giorgio and her show, Speak Up for Your Health. She is a former chief medical officer for United Healthcare Group. She is a first-generation American from Baltimore who went to Johns Hopkins, Greek American, and she has been such an inspiration to me. And she is a medical doctor who does a lot of correspondence. She was also a guest at the Health Podcast Summit, shared a lot about her journey and how she monetizes or doesn't actually monetize her podcast in some ways, because she uses other things, her speaking, consulting, and writing and things like that to actually monetize. And her podcast is sort of front center. She shares all this on the Health Podcast Summit session. And the reason I recommend her podcast, she had a mutual friend of ours, Ivo Minkoff, on the other day at the end of February. And then she speaks to both professionals and people who are trying to navigate healthcare. So it doesn't matter if you're a health professional and you are practicing medicine every day, all week, or if you're somebody who's trying to navigate it for yourself or somebody in your family or someone you care about. Her podcast, she does an excellent job distilling it down, providing key takeaways at the end of each episode, and really having a very humane conversation that I believe everyone should listen to. So Speak Up for Your Health by Dr. Arkell Giorgio.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Well, Dan, is there anything else that we haven't touched on when we look at advertisers, podcast networks, podcasters, or anyone in the industry that they should know about podcast networks and specifically what you're building?
Well, I encourage anyone to go check out healthpodcast.org, check out the One Mission, the 4 platforms that we're building across that. I do not want to underemphasize the importance of your role in all of this, Greg, and the influence that you've been on me. And I really want people to follow and subscribe to your podcast. You are really making change. You've been such a positive contributor in what I'm doing, and I'm so grateful for you and for this opportunity to speak to your audience. And I really think that you're the one to watch as we go forward in podcasting, and you see all the different areas. I'm just focused in this health vertical, which actually I say is a health horizontal, because health cuts across all these decisions we make, whether it's around politics or farming or transportation or education or whatever we're doing. Horizontal health cuts across all of that. But with what you're doing and the visibility you're bringing on the podcast aspect, I think it's really powerful. So thanks very much for the opportunity.
I appreciate it. I mean, that's been the joys of doing this, is seeing, I mean, you've got the Podcast Network Alliance where you guys all kind of share your notes, but at the same time, you're still so focused on just your overall business. And I'm like, I network for a living. I want to just talk to anyone that's got a podcast or is in the industry, and understanding that you see how many podcasts join a network and they're unhappy with what they were promised, or you see networks whose business model, like yours, has changed and evolved. And as such, because your business model continues to change, there's some times where it's like, all right, someone that's in your network, look, business model is evolving. It's nothing personal. It's just, this is where I'm taking this. Either you want to stay with me or you don't. And I think from anyone that's listening, that's something that we should all kind of understand, that businesses will evolve, whether it's your own podcast or the network. I will keep pushing you and enjoying the journey that you've been on. So thanks for letting me be part of it. And thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you, Greg.
Well, you've made it this far, and I greatly appreciate it. So if you allow me a few extra minutes of your time, let me give you my thoughts on my conversation with Dan. As I said at the top, this is going to be a lot about integrity. So if you structured your podcast, your network around a pledge to yourself around integrity, I can say Dan made me think more about my pledge to you as a listener. Also walked away from this with hearing someone who took their technical background with a deeply personal belief and passion around better science backed by real research. I heard a lot of brain, a lot of heart from Dan. If we think about it, there are a lot of networks that operate around KPIs of sponsorship dollars and downloads. In Dan's case, there's so much more fueling the evolution of how he's built his network. It supports podcasters and this podcast industry. These aren't just stories Dan wants to tell, but changes he wants to make through science-backed content. As Dan said, and I highly recommend, please go connect with him. Go check out what he's building. I'll have the information in the show notes. And lastly, I want to thank those that have helped make this show possible. The show's hosted on rss.com, podcast hosting platform. I'm the head of relationships for rss.com. This show is produced by Stories and Strategies. Shout out to that team. Highly recommend connecting with them. Content's repurposed by Cast Magic. And for my project management, I'm using Northflow. As we always say, subscribe to make sure you don't miss an episode. Follow me on LinkedIn to make sure you stay up to date what I'm creating and working on in podcasting and relationships. And as I always say, life is about time and relationships. You never know where one conversation will take you. That's how I'm able to bring these conversations to you. So I'm waiting for you to connect with me so I can have a conversation. Reach out and keep listening.